You may or may not be aware that this congregation recently joined something called Voice, or Virginians Organized for Interfaith Community Engagement. Voice is a coalition of around 50 faith communities working to address systemic social justice issues in Northern Virginia. Now, getting integrated into Voice has not been easy during a pandemic, but I have hopes that you will be hearing about initiatives in the not too distant future that we will want to become a part of. Now, recently, a church member and I attended one of the Voice meetings, and this particular meeting was seeking to address issues in the woefully inadequate Fairfax County mental health system. Even for people of means, accessing emergency mental health care when a family member is having a crisis is extremely difficult. And the situation is much more dire if you are poor. One of the things that I learned, among many things that I learned at this meeting, was that in Virginia, state law requires that any mental health prescription or medication must be prescribed for people on Medicaid, must be prescribed by a psychiatrist. You can't have prescriptions from general practitioners. But here's the catch. Not a single psychiatrist in Fairfax County accepts Medicaid patients. It is difficult for anyone to get good mental health care. But if you are poor, it is nearly impossible. Hear this, you that trample the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over so that we can sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the ephah small and the shekel great, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. The prophet in our reading this morning addresses the wealthy inhabitants of the land of Israel who claim to be worshipers of God, but whose real only concern is making more money by whatever means, fair or not. Israel is a land with a growing wealthy class, but it is a two-tiered society, with some living in luxury and others living in poverty. And the prophet insists that God has noticed and will not tolerate this situation for long. In our own day, we have individuals that have amassed staggering amounts of wealth. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have so much money that they can pursue personal space programs, something that was once the purview only of governments. And for many of these billionaires, they are loath to share what they have with the community at large. They figure out ways to pay considerably smaller percentage of their wealth in income taxes than any of us do. The actual tax rate for many billionaires is lower than your or my tax rate. And the companies of these billionaires work tirelessly to hang on to every cent of profit that they can. Amazon, Google, Apple, Starbucks, and more engage in intimidation and in labor law violations in order to prevent the unionization of their blue-collar workers. Meanwhile, the pay gap between CEOs and workers continues to expand. A recent study show that the pay ratio of CEOs to workers has grown to 670 to 1. The average salary for CEOs at the top 300 American companies is $10.6 million. The median income of workers in this country is around $24,000. The prophet in our passage today, in part of a reading we didn't hear, speaks to the Jeff Bezos and to the Elon Musks of his day. Therefore, because you trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. The prophet sees gathering gloom and doom because of the basic inequities in the society. And the prophet insists that no amount of religion will do any good. In words prior to the ones we heard this morning, the prophet speaks on behalf of God and says, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The prophet insists that any religion that is not concerned with building a fair and just and equitable society is an affront to God. Spirituality that does not concern itself with the poor and the needy and the vulnerable is a good way to get yourself further away from God rather than closer. I can't imagine that Amos' message was very well received. He not only railed against the well-to-do and the powers that be in Israel, but he was a foreigner to boot. He came from the neighboring kingdom of Judah. It would be a little bit like someone from Canada came to Washington, D.C., and began to yell and scream that because of continuing systemic poverty and racism in this country, God was about to lower the boom on us. I wonder, how many of us can imagine that the situation is dire enough that God would want to act, that God would actually intervene? And if our God would never get angry and never seek to punish, is our God the God of the Bible, or simply a concept of God that suits us? And you can't wriggle out of such questions by making the popular distinction between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New. The story of Jesus is the story of God intervening in history. And Jesus can sound very much like Amos. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. That sounds to me like God will sit idly by only for so long. It sounds to me like God is going to, at some point, act and turn things upside down. And those who lived luxuriously will find themselves on the bottom. Those who suffered will find themselves on the top. Those who enjoyed themselves in the midst of that suffering will find the shoe on the other foot. And this is Jesus. no Old Testament prophet. Can we hear the words of Amos and the words of Jesus in a way that unnerves us, in a way that worries us? Is our God real enough that real action on the part of God is even a possibility? When I was working on this sermon, I came across a quote by the famous preacher and professor at Duke Divinity School, Will Willimon, who writes, "One way you can tell the difference between a true and living God and a dead and fake God is that a false God will never tell you anything that will make you angry and uncomfortable." Can our God make us angry or uncomfortable? False gods are nice because they always tell you what you want to hear, and they always act just in the way that you would expect. But of course, such false gods are a little different than the idols that used to upset the Old Testament prophets. So, I want a real God, a God that cares for the same people that Jesus cared for, a God who cares enough about me to disturb me and prompt me to become a representative, an agent of God's dream for a new world. And what could be more important or more satisfying than to be a part of that? All praise and glory to the God who comes into history in Jesus the Christ to proclaim the coming hope of a new day. Thanks be to God.